As a result, slavery took hold again all across the South and into the Southwest, and this is the thing. It's slavery, before it's finally stopped by the Civil War, expands tremendously in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Had it not been for the Civil War, slavery would have continued to expand. Talk a bit more about that later. But as we see slavery expand tremendously across the South, by the time of the Civil War, there will be 4 million enslaved people in the American South. We see American slavery start to take on certain unique characteristics. Most particularly, slavery in the American South is often referred to as the quote-unquote peculiar institution, right? What does that mean? Peculiar. Peculiar means strange, right? Why would they call slavery a peculiar institution? Well, I'll tell you why. Because most of the world had already abolished slavery. All right? The British colonies, they emancipate all the slaves in all of their colonies in 1832. Right? Latin American countries, when they get their independence, they either abolish slavery or begin to gradually abolish slavery. Mexico abolishes slavery, and then in 1829 frees every slave who is still enslaved in Mexico. Argentina, Chile, later Colombia and Peru, which relied more upon slavery than the others, but all Latin American countries are moving towards abolishing slavery, with 2 very important exceptions: Brazil and Cuba. Now, slavery in Brazil and Cuba is different than it is in the American South. But people, the English, who have become very much opposed to slavery by this point, they look at America and they think, wow, goodness gracious, this is a very barbaric practice, which, is mostly being phased out around the world. How is it that Southern Americans are deepening their commitment to slavery? Well, Southerners defend themselves. And most often they point to the fact that the slave population in America naturally reproduced itself. What do I mean by that? The African American population in America continued to grow despite the fact that newly arrived African imports were stopped in 1808. So no new black folks are arriving in the American South from Africa after 1808. Actually, that's different from Cuba and Brazil. Both Cuba and Brazil, had they outlawed the African slave trade, their slave population would have diminished. But in America, the enslaved population continues to grow because women and men are having children. It's a natural great rate of reproduction. Now, why is that? Well, we talked about that earlier, right? There's more women in the American colonies. They don't grow sugar. So sugar is the most brutal of the commodities that you can produce and the most lethal for enslaved people. They grow cotton. Cotton is boring, right? Growing cotton is boring, right? Actually, that's one thing. There's not much variety. You go out and you pick it and you put it in a sack and then you weigh it. There's really not much more to it than that. But it's also not particularly dangerous, right? So as a result, the African American population in the South, they weren't worked to death. They were probably fed a little bit better than they were in Brazil and in Cuba. But it was mostly the fact that the population was increasing because, men and women have children, right? The fact that there was a natural reproduction in America was pointed to by the Southern slaveholders. What they said is well, if we treated them so badly, why would they have kids, right? And this was the argument they made to say that slavery in the American South was not very severe. Another argument that they said, we don't treat them like enslaved people. We don't beat them, right? Now, there was very few enslaved people in the American South who were, went their entire life without being touched by the whip even once. But there is probably some truth to this. The fact of the matter is that perhaps American slaveholders did treat the enslaved people better than they did in Brazil. But there's a reason for this. Brazil, they could continue to import newly enslaved people from Africa. The American South could not. Hence, they protected their quote-unquote property more because it was much more difficult to replace. That is the fundamental reason why there was probably less abuse of the slave population in America than there was in, say, Brazil. But then Brazil, because the slave population was growing through imports from Africa, an enslaved person could also be freed and then replaced by a newly arrived slave from Africa. That wasn't the case in America. So that enslaved people, maybe they were treated a little bit better. Maybe their life was valued a bit much more in America because they were difficult to replace, but they could never escape slavery. And in fact, most southern states, beginning with Virginia, had rules that didn't even allow free black people to live in their states. A couple of reasons for this, but the most important being that they thought that free black folks were a bad influence on the enslaved black population. But they were also trying to narrow the difference between slavery and blackness. In the American South, 99.9% of the African American people that you would encounter were enslaved. That's why in Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, when Solomon Northup is abducted from the North and sold into slavery in the South, he's a black man who was free in the North and he's sold into the South as a slave. When he says that he was a free man, no one believes him because, no one he encounters has ever seen a free black person in their entire life, right? In any case, this leads to a belief amongst the Southern planters that theirs is a system not based upon brutality and violence and forcing people to do work against their will. Rather, they say it's a system based upon paternalism. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at this racist picture here under the heading the peculiar institution, the idea was that these benevolent white slaveholders treated the enslaved people who worked on their plantations as children, right? Now, that's incredibly insulting if you really think about it. It infantilizes an entire race of people. But Southerners justified their treatment of African Americans and their enslavement of African Americans by referring to them, we don't really call them slaves. They would call them quote unquote Negroes or, and this is kind of disgusting, our black family, right? So they reimagine the relationship between slaveholder and slave as one of paternal and even, affective affiliation, whereas in fact it was, of course, really still a system that predicated entirely upon violence or upon the threat of violence. So that's the basis of paternalism in the so-called peculiar institution. It's a cover story by white Southern plantation holders to make excuses for the fact that they still have slaves, to point to the natural reproduction rate and say that in fact black people were, and this is hard to talk about this, but they would say that they were actually prospering under slavery. It's hard to imagine a more perverse set of ideas than this. But nevertheless, they were prevalent in the American South. Now, when the Civil War comes, there are 4 million slaves in the South. Anywhere from 800,000 to 1 million of them run away during the Civil War. So all these white Southerners who thought that the enslaved people on their plantation loved them and that there was a, effective tie, which was, resembled kinship between master and enslaved person, when they see all the slaves running away, they're actually surprised. Right? And I've read this time and time, and again in the primary documents. White slaveholders are surprised when they see African Americans run away from them during the Civil War. They thought that actually theirs was a relationship of codependency, of like between a father and a son. Well, obviously that was not correct, because otherwise they would not have run away at the very first opportunity that they got. Now, there's other effects of slavery on the South, right? In the South, there are still yeoman farmers because there's really no transportation revolution in the South. So there's areas in the South and the upcountry and the hills where, poorer white folks live, the term hillbillies, right? These are poorer white folks who live in the mountains. They don't own slaves. The majority of Southerners did not own slaves, right? Southern whites who lived in the mountains and in the hills generally did not own slaves. They lived on farms where they grew everything for themselves, fed themselves, and really had very little connection with the outside world. They were very isolated. Even as in the North, the market revolution started to connect all farmers into this larger integrated economy connected by transportation networks. In the South, yeoman farmers who had no railroads or canals to ship their goods on, they remained largely self-sufficient and isolated, right? So did they own slaves? No. Were they opposed to slavery? No, they were not, right? The fact of the matter is that, in America, we've already seen this, that the idea of freedom, of getting ahead, predicates upon the acquisition of land, right? It's the same in the South. Southern Americans dreamed of getting land that they could grow cotton on, but they didn't want to grow the cotton themselves. They realized that they could absolutely not compete with the great planters unless they too owned slaves. So for Southern whites, this idea of getting ahead in the economy meant owning slaves, right? So even if they didn't own slaves, they hoped that one day they would have enslaved people working on their plantations. So they did not question it. They believed in slavery, even if they did not participate in it themselves, because they thought that one day they too may be great, like the great planters of the South. And the only way that they would be great was by owning land, but also owning slaves. So the dream of slave ownership actually meant that white farmers, poor white farmers who lived in the hills of the South, were also dedicated to slavery because they hoped that one day they too could be great slaveholders. Added to that is the fact that many folks who lived up in the hill country in the South were also often connected by ties of kinship or blood to planters downstate, right? There were a lot of kinship connections connecting people in the hills to the planters, so that they, even if they didn't own slaves themselves, they certainly didn't want to go against their cousin or their uncle who was a great slaveholder downstate. So kinship ties meant that they were also attached to slaves. Another thing is too, right, is that owning slaves meant in the South that you had made it. If you look at slide number 34, right, you see one of these great southern plantations, the people, the white folks strolling around the pond with, plantations in the background. You don't see a single slave in this picture, right? But that lifestyle was not possible without slaves to do all the work, right? Southerners depended upon slavery for their economic status as well. There are their houses, the fancy rugs, the chandeliers, they were literally made out of slaves. What do I mean by that? They could not have these fancy things without the wealth that had been generated by the slaves. Slavery made Southern white Americans wealthy, right? It made them rich. It also made them even whiter. And I mean this literally. Southern white women, they vaunted their women. They like, look at my beautiful, pale, creamy skin, they might say, right? Why do I have that? Because I don't have to work. Who does the work? The enslaved people on the plantation do. So I can stay in the shade and I don't have to go into the sun, and my skin can remain literally whiter than the farm wives upstate who have to go out and work in the in the hills with their husbands, right? So I mean, owning slaves could literally make your skin whiter, could make you more wealthy, and much of the property that was owned by these wealthy Southerners was literally made out of slavery. Southern wealth was made out of slavery, right? And any Southerner, whether they owned people as property or not, hoped that one day they too could join the ranks of these wealthy Southerners, but to do so would mean owning an enslaved person. So for Southern whites who didn't have much money, who didn't have much means, the dream of slave ownership opened up a whole world of wealth and possibility that they one day hope to attain. You see, when the Civil War breaks out, right, Abraham Lincoln assumes that Southern whites who do not own slaves will gladly join the Union cause. Right? What do they have in common with the slaveholders? He said, in fact, the slaveholders, they've been holding them down, right? But then in fact, during the Civil War, almost the vast majority of the fighting was done by Southern whites who didn't own slaves, right? Why would Southern whites from the hill country who didn't own slaves go fight and die to defend the property of slaveholders? Well, I think it's because this dream of Southern prosperity rested upon the idea of owning enslaved people. And that is the idea that animated wealthy whites as well as poor whites, and really did join the two together. Frankly, the repression of the black population by both people who owned enslaved people and people who did not resulted in a kind of white supremacy in the South, right? Which has its roots before the Civil War, but grows even stronger after the Civil War, right? So this increasingly rigid division between white and black in the South is predicated upon slavery and the dream that if you want to be a Southerner with wealth, if you want to be a Southerner who truly makes it, then you would need to own people, right? That is what makes Southern white supremacy. So what we see then is a clear division between North and South. As North becomes a manufacturing and commercial agricultural society connected by railroads and canals that reach across the country, creating one integrated economic unit, the South follows a different course. Basically, they grow cotton. And as slavery grows west, it reproduces the plantation economy first in Georgia, then in Mississippi, then in Alabama, then in Louisiana and Arkansas, and finally in Texas, right? They're not investing technology. They're not innovating. What they're doing is they're just making more plantations. This is extensive development, right? There's no capital or technological improvements which grow the economy. The only thing which grows the Southern economy is the appearance of more and more and more plantations. So whereas the Southern economy is underdeveloped, reliant upon only one crop, cotton, nevertheless, the South does grow economically. So we can talk about a Southern market revolution, but that market revolution is very different than the one in the North because there's only one crop, cotton, and there's no free labor, right? And there's no immigrants. No one immigrates to the South. Anyone who immigrates to America goes to the North because they realize that there's no economic opportunities in the South and that the field work is done almost entirely by enslaved people in the South. So the South does have economic development, but that economic development is extensive, not intensive. It is centered around the development of one crop, cotton. Wealthy Southerners have all of their wealth tied up in land and in enslaved people. That's their property. Whereas the Northern economy is much more diverse, dynamic, fluid, capitalized, and technologically advanced. The South, economic growth is just more plantations. So what we see then is that we both South and North develop economically in the 19th century, but in two very different ways. As the North becomes more diverse and complex, the South, they just grow more plantations. So that is another major difference between North and South. It's an economic difference. So as we see then, eventually, of course, this is going to lead us to the Civil War.